Right, back to making some progress with the Escort. Get myself stuck in the engine bay after I've rebuilt the gearbox, and I've managed to get the steering column and the pedal box all put back together. It seemed in a pretty good condition, just dirty and dusty from being kicking around in the garage and sitting in the car for many years. These are definitely a lot easier to strip down on a bench than they are in the car. There's only about 4 bolts that hold the whole unit in, so it's easy just to take that out. So all I do with this is just give it a strip down, inspect all the parts. I noticed that the clutch quadrant, which I thought was okay, actually does have a flat spot on it where the teeth have just vanished, so we'll get a new one of those ordered. Quite a common problem that you get on these cars. Just get everything stripped down, give it a quick rub down, and then just a quick coat of gloss black paint just to make it look a little bit more original. Aquablasted a few of the little aluminium parts just to make them look a bit fresher. The rubber pedals were in relatively good condition, so I just aquablasted them up as well. I tested the brake light switch before I put it all back together, just doing a quick continuity test on a multimeter. Just basically get a bleep when the switch is triggered, so that it's joined the circuit together. With this, triggering the switch made absolutely no difference. I had a feeling that this switch was ready for the bin, so we'll just get a new one of those ordered. I think they're about £8 off eBay, so easily enough to get hold of. Then it's just a case of getting everything rebuilt back together. The clutch quadrant kit comes complete with new washers, so they can all go on. The main shaft that goes through that holds the pedals in place can only go in one way round, so pretty simple to do. A little bit of faffing with the ratchet mechanism just to get that in place, but it's not too bad once you sort of get the hang of it, which way around everything goes. Good idea to take some photos when you strip the original unit down. Remember doing one of these in the car years ago. No idea how on earth I managed to do that. It's bad enough getting in the car now, even when it's completely empty. So clearly it was a lot more flexible back then. Once it's all back together, I just give the ratchet side of it a quick test. That's how all the washers go, which was something that I did have to search for a few photos. And then it's just a case of getting the steering column put back together. It's just sort of like loosely just attach them on there for now, just so it can go back in the car. One of the wheels came in really handy just to hold it in place while I stuck round the front and attached the bolts. It's amazing what you can find to help you out when you do all these things on your own. And then I just attached the accelerator pedal back in after I'd just given it a quick freshen up. And then onto the gear selector. So this was absolutely caked in mud, oil, dirt. Really basic thing to strip down, just a few plastic clips and 10mm nuts that hold it all together. I just removed the main 2 shafts. I think one of them's the locator while the other one is the actual selector shaft. My idea with this is just to get it all apart, get it all cleaned up and then rebuilt. So you can see how dirty that was. So yeah, we'll give that a clean up, a degrease and a blast. In the side of these is 2 springs that just got a Torx bit that just puts the tension on them. You can just take them out pretty easily. And then there's just like a little ball bearing that sits at the top, that sits against a plastic clip that pushes against the actual gear lever itself. Then just a quick light sanding of the selector shafts. So I'm just going to give these a light coat of some zinc spray paint. I think as standard from the factory they're yellow nickel plated or zinc plated. Then it's just a case of rebuilding everything back together, which is much easier now it's all nice and clean. So I put some fresh grease in the bottom of the selector. It makes it a lot easier to hold the little the plastic locating pieces in there, just sort of makes them stick a little bit while you put it all back together. I left the springs out for now because they're much easier to put in after. So really basic with these, say a couple of 10mm bolts, a few plastic clips, and it all just drops back together. Just popped a little bit of grease on the springs before they go in just to stop them rusting up in there, and then it's a case of just tightening up the self-tapping Torx bit. And once that's back together, it's just a case of putting the gaiter on the top, and then I'll just do a quick test fit of the gear knob, and then pop it back in the car, just push it up through the bottom, and then it's 4 10mm nuts that go on the top. You don't want to tighten these fully up before you attach it to the gearbox, because it will need a little bit of forward and backwards adjustment to get it all lined up right. Then it's time to get started onto the actual gearbox itself. Absolutely covered in dirt and oil and dust and grime and a bit of overspray here and there. The clutch release bearing seems to be jammed solid, so I've got to get that freed up. One way of telling if it is an RS Turbo gearbox with a limited slip diff is if you look through the drive shaft area, you should be able to see a hole straight through there. So just give it a hoover and a wire brush at the same time to try and get rid of as much dirt as possible. So the first thing to try and get released is the clutch release lever. Plenty of WD-40 on that, and then just keep tapping it back and forward with a hammer. I then just took the nut off the release bearing on the inside, and then it was a case of just forward and backwards for quite some time, and then I used the pry bar just to lift it. Clearly while it's been sat there for a while, water's just got in there and caused a bit of corrosion. Once that's out, I pop the release bearing off. Looks like it's had like a self-tapped screw put in there at some point in its life, so probably have to drill that out and thread it and put a nut in there, something a little bit better than what it is. And then as I've gone along with this, I just try and degrease it as much as possible. Just pop the nuts out the end panel and then just take that off, and then I just crack the nut on the drain plug while I'm at it before I get too far into this, just to make it a little bit easier. It's in pretty tight, so better to do that now. And then I just undo the selector shaft locating pins. Not sure on the official name for them, but they seem to be like a pin that sits with the ball bearing in the end that just sits and locates the selector shaft. And then there's just a circlip on the fear there, so I just pop that off. And then on the reverse selector, there's just a Torx bit there to just release that, so just undo that. And that allows me to remove that gear with that selector all as one unit. This gearbox at some point looks like it has had a refurb done. It's got sealer throughout it all, so it does look like it has had some work done to it at some point in its life. Sealer certain doesn't look like it was there from the factory. And then I'm sure there's a better way of getting these spring clips off of the gears, but I find 2 screwdrivers and a little bit of perseverance just gets them off. And there's another little spring clip, so I'll just pop that off. That went flying, so I managed to find that luckily enough. And then just went round the edge of this end casing with a Stanley knife blade just to try and break some of the sealer that's on there. Felt like it was on pretty solid, so just chopped a bit of it away and managed to lift it up slightly. So they have 2 really big spring clips at the end of these. Haynes' manual says just knock them off with a hammer, which seemed to do the trick. And then just drop the last selector locating pin out. And then just go around and undo all the bolts for the gearbox housing. And again, just go around the edge with a knife just to try and break the seal slightly. Don't really want to put too much pressure on trying to split the casing. Cast aluminium isn't the strongest thing, and I don't need to be having to buy another gearbox for this. After a few taps with a rubber mallet, I managed to just get the pry bar in a few little locations without putting too much pressure on it. It does eventually pop up and come apart. One thing I noticed is it's missing the magnet that would be in there to collect any metal filings, so it's definitely been apart at some point. Then I just take out the reverse light switch, which is damaged, so I'm going to get that replaced. So the selector shaft has like a outer sleeve to it that has 2 circlips on it, so just remove those, and then just with a little bit of gentle persuasion from the pry bar, just manage to slide that shaft up and out of the way. And then in one movement you grab both gears sets and the selector shaft and just lift it all out in one go. And then just remove I think that's the reverse gear selector, so just pop that out of the way. and then the diff can be lifted out at that point. Don't think these diffs are actually serviceable. There's nothing you can do with these apart from replace the bearings. The bearings and everything on this gearbox actually look brand new. So just tilt that over and just drop the like a selector plate out of the way, and then 2 bolts holding the selector mechanism. So just undo those, and then we've got the input shaft seal on there, and then the bearings that are still in there. So the selector shaft just has a hex bolt that just needs to come out, and that will allow that to be removed. And then I just drop the drive shaft oil seals out of the gearbox. Then tried to get the speedo drive out. The split pin was absolutely wedged in there. No matter how I tried to pull it out, it just was not coming. I tried to drill it out, but I believe they're made of hardened steel. Although I managed to get it slightly drilled, I just couldn't get anywhere close to where I needed to be. So I left the speedo in for now, and then just started to plug up any holes before I stick it in the aqua blaster. Just try and minimise glass bead getting in as many places as possible. It goes absolutely everywhere, and I was sort of thinking of not actually aqua blasting this gearbox, just for the fact that I knew it was going to be hours and hours of cleaning, but I don't think there's any other way I can get it as clean as what I'd like it without doing it. So that's after the first blasting. It's come up quite nice and clean, much better than what it was, a lot more easy to work with now it's not covered. I start off by just blowing it out with the airline. I've ran it under the hose pipe outside for about 20 minutes, try and get as much of the glass out as possible, but it is going to be covered in it still, just not able to see it. So I find that I just dry it out, and then I go over it with degreaser and some brake cleaner, and then dry it out again. I didn't remove the main bearing at first because apparently you have to break the plastic casing to get it out, but I found just by putting a little bit of compressed air behind it, it just popped up, so that was quite easy. And then with the speedo drive, I just used a diamond tipped bit on the Dremel and just cut some little grooves in the top of the pin so that it would give me something for the chisel just to grip onto, and then I just managed to tap it out. It was still quite firmly stuck in there, so a little tap with the pry bar and it just knocked it loose enough to pop it out. Then after several runs through the aqua blaster and multiple washes with the hose pipe and some degreaser, and then went over it as well with some fine Scotch-Brite just to make sure everything's clear, and then washed it all over again. Started reassembling it. So first thing to do is get the diff bearing carriers in place. One side slightly different to the other, where it has like a seating washer and it has a little bit of movement in it. And then I just tapped the other side in place just using a hammer and punch. Didn't have a socket big enough to use that, so I just kept going round and round just to keep it going evenly in. Then just give the oil spinner a clean and drop the main bearing in its place. Before I drop the diff in, I just put a little bit of assembly lube around the bearing carrier. And then all the other components that I took out of the gearbox, I've just given a clean up with some degreaser. There's been no need to take the bearings off the main shafts. Everything seems pretty much like new on the internals. No bits of metal kicking around, no damage to anything, no markings or wear on the bearings. Just replace the seals and put it back together. So the next part to go in is the selector shaft. So that just pushes through, and then the selector end just bolts to the end of that. And there you go, you can see how that sort of works and moves things left and right and up and down. Then the reverse gear lifter goes on the side there, and that won't actually fit on if you put the selector mechanism back in, so that needs to go back on first. You don't need to have to put the spring tension on it yet, you can do that after, but just needs to be back in place. Then the selector components all go in together. You just sort of line them all up and then just drop the shaft in its locating hole, and just line the 2 bolt holes up for the selector itself. And there you can see all the sort of linkage together. It pushes it up and down and left and right movement. And there's the reverse gear lifter. We'll leave that spring off till after we've done. And then the reverse gear selector rod goes in. That just locates in its hole, and then you just turn it counterclockwise to move it in and out of position. I used a cable tie to hold both the gear sets together with the selectors, just to make it a little bit easier while holding them. Once they're lined up, they just drop in place, and then I just had to lift it again because the reverse gear lifter just needs to fit in place. Just a little bit of faffing, but nothing too bad, to be honest. That's all together, and that's the reverse gear lifter there. Just see how that just fastens underneath in that little groove underneath the gear. And then the selector shaft sleeve just drops over there, and that has the two little circlips on it to hold it in place. And then just got the selector plate in position. So triple checked that to make sure it was right. Just didn't want to get it all back together and then find that something internal was not quite lined up right enough to take it all apart again. And just got hold of a new reverse gear switch, so that can go straight in now. So when I took it apart, there was no magnet in the gearbox. I don't know if there's a reason why people take them out, but I got a new one from Ford, so just drop that in place. And then I wasn't sure whether or not to use sealer or not, but I figured it'd be better to have sealer on, so just go around both the surfaces with some silicone sealer, and then the gasket on top. Then put both the housings together, and then I went over with the tap through all the threads just to make sure that it was all nice and clean, make it easier to bolt all back together. Then it was at this point that I realised that I'd not put the magnet in the gearbox, so I managed to just undo it enough just to lift it up far enough just to be able to pop the magnet in place. Then just got the other drive shaft oil seal in. Just use the old one as something to drive it in with, and then on to putting the large spring clips on top of the bearings. So one is slightly bigger than the other, so don't get them mixed up or else it's a bit of a battle. There was a very slight groove on this housing just to be able to lift this bearing up into place, and the gasket for this end plate is quite a thick one. I'm not going to bother with any sealer on this, and just torques down the bolts for that. Then there's another spring clip that just goes on that shaft there. It does have to sit really tight onto this shaft because it sits within the gear that goes on there, or else the gear won't actually sit all the way down far enough for you to get the top circlip on. Then just a case of putting the gears on in reverse order to what they came off. Just trying to keep everything as clean as possible while doing this. And once that's in place, it's the selector pins just go in. Then just drop in the other drive shaft oil seal. Same again, using the old one to help drive it in. Then just refit the speedo drive, put a new rubber O-ring on that. And then the end casing, I'd just given a blast and a sand over, and then just painted it with some zinc paint just to make it look a little bit more fresher. And did put a little bit of silicone on the side of the end plates, just because it's steel and a little bit of corrosion around the edges that I'd cleaned up, so rather than risk any leaks. Then with that all torqued up, managed to lift it into the engine bay of the car. I'd already got the engine mounts in place. I had just slackened off the one at the back just to give me a little bit of movement. Used a axle stand to hold the engine side of the gearbox up. Got stuck in there at one point, had to climb my way out. So the reason for leaving the selector slightly loose was just to move the bar backwards and forwards, just so you can line it up to the gearbox. And then to set the selector shaft correctly, you put it in reverse gear and then use a pin just to lock the selector. Then push the selector on the gearbox as far forward as possible and then clockwise, which should select reverse gear, and then just tighten everything up. Then just remove the pin out of the gear selector, which should still be in reverse. Then give it a try, and we seem to get all 5 gears, which is good. So on and off, this rebuild's taken me roughly around about 4 weekends, quite some time, and most of that was cleaning. Not the most interesting video, but hopefully helpful to anybody who's having a go at rebuilding their gearbox themselves. Thank you for watching.